Here is a question that nobody in intelligence likes to answer. If you were designing the perfect spy, someone who could walk into a hostile city, build a life there from nothing, survive months of sustained deception without breaking, and extract information that armies couldn't reach, what would that person look like? Not what you imagined, is it? In the summer of 1973, a woman rented an apartment in Beirut, Lebanon. She told her neighbors she was a foreign scriptwriter. She went to the market. She learned the streets. She built the kind of small, unremarkable social life that makes a person invisible. The kind of life that says, I belong here. I have always belonged here. There is nothing to look at. Her name, for the purposes of everything that followed, was Yael. That was not her real name. Her real name has never been officially released. She was a Canadian-born woman who had immigrated to Israel in her 30s, been recruited into the Mossad's Caesarea unit, the agency's Special Operations Division, and sent alone into one of the most dangerous cities in the Middle East. Not with a team, not with backup on the ground. Alone. Beirut in 1973 was not a city at peace. It was a city in the middle of a long, slow negotiation between order and collapse. Palestinian militant organizations had significant infrastructure there. Syrian intelligence was active. Multiple factions with competing agendas operated in the same neighborhoods, sometimes in the same buildings. A foreign woman who asked the wrong question to the wrong neighbor didn't get a warning. She got disappeared. Yael knew this. She went anyway. What her commanders in Tel Aviv knew, and what she may not have been told in full, was that the operation she was feeding intelligence for was already behind schedule. The targets she was watching were among the most protected men in Lebanon. Previous attempts to gather the kind of precise, real-time intelligence needed to authorize a strike had come up short. The pressure from above was significant. The margin for error from below was shrinking. She had been given a camera. A modified one, compact enough to conceal, capable enough to document building layouts, entry points, guard positions, the kind of granular detail that turns a vague military ambition into an executable plan. Every day she moved through the city. Every day she filed away another piece of the picture. She was doing this in a city where the wrong face, the wrong accent on a single word, the wrong way of peeling an orange at a cafe table could end everything. There is a story, told about a different female Mossad operative operating in a different city, a different decade, about exactly that. A moment at an airport in Alexandria, a voice calling her name across a crowded terminal, someone who knew her from before the mission. She said, "You must be mistaken," and walked away. That was the entire margin. One sentence, one controlled reaction, one decision made in under 2 seconds that determined whether she walked out of that airport or didn't. Yael's margin was the same. Every single day, for months. The 3 men she was watching were senior figures in the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They were not symbolic targets, they were operational. Their names were on the list that Golda Meir's government had compiled after Munich, after 11 Israeli athletes were murdered at the Olympic Games in September 1972, and the world watched, and the men responsible walked away. Israel's response to Munich was not immediate, it was deliberate. A sustained, methodical campaign to locate every person involved and eliminate them, wherever they were, however long it took. The operation had a name that has since become well known. What is less well known is how much of it depended not on soldiers or explosives, but on women sitting in foreign apartments, building cover identities, learning the geography of cities that wanted them dead. Yael was one of those women, but she was not the first. 19 years before Yael moved into her Beirut apartment, a different woman was sitting in a Cairo hotel restaurant, believing the worst was already behind her. Her name was Marcel Nino. She was 24 years old. She had been born in Cairo to a Bulgarian father and a Turkish mother, and had grown up there, moving through the city's Catholic schools and Jewish clubs and sports courts with the ease of someone who had never had reason to feel foreign in the place she was from. She had been recruited by Israeli military intelligence in 1951. Her role in the network was not to plant anything or destroy anything. She was a liaison. She moved information between people. She kept the chain intact. In the summer of 1954, that chain broke. The operation she had been embedded in, later known by several names, most infamously as the Lavon Affair, was a false flag campaign. The plan was to detonate devices in American and British civilian buildings in Cairo and Alexandria, make the attacks appear to be the work of Egyptian radicals, and use the resulting instability to convince Western governments that Egypt under Nasser was too dangerous to trust. The devices were placed: libraries, a post office, a British-owned theater. Then one of them went off early, in a man's pocket, on a public street in Alexandria. Within hours, Egyptian intelligence was moving. What Marcel Nino did not know, what most of the cell did not know, was that there had already been questions raised inside the Mossad itself about the man running the operation on the ground. His name was Avri Elad. He operated under a false identity. He had been the one who recruited additional members, who organized the network, who was the link between the cell and Tel Aviv. There were doubts about him, quiet doubts, the kind of doubts that get raised in internal meetings and then get set aside because the operation is already in motion, and stopping it feels more complicated than continuing. The operation continued. Nino fled Cairo the day the arrests began. She took a bus to a Mediterranean resort town on the coast. She found a hotel. She sat down in the restaurant. She ordered lunch. Her name came over the loudspeaker. She walked toward the telephone. Egyptian intelligence agents were waiting. She was taken to Cairo. She was interrogated. She did not break. She attempted suicide multiple times during her imprisonment. She did not break. She was sentenced to 15 years. She was held alone in the women's prison at Kanathar, isolated from the male prisoners, isolated from any information about what was happening outside those walls. She was 24 when she went in. 2 decades later, Yael was building her cover in Beirut, watching men whose names were on a list that existed partly because of what had happened in Munich, partly because of what had happened in Cairo, partly because of every compounded failure and partial success and abandoned operative that had shaped the Mossad into the institution that was now asking her to stay in a hostile city, alone, for as long as the mission required. She did not know yet how long that would be. She did not know yet what the mission would ask of her after the operation she was feeding was complete, whether leaving immediately would be safe, whether staying would be survivable, whether the men making those decisions in Tel Aviv were working from accurate assumptions about what her exposure actually cost. She knew the targets. She knew the buildings. She knew the schedules. She ate dinner in the Phoenicia Hotel with a colleague and answered a question about her neighbors. What she did not know, what no one in the field ever fully knows, is whether the people sending the orders home understand what the person in the city is actually carrying. That question does not get answered in the briefing room. It only gets answered later, after, in ways that cannot be undone. The operation that Yael was feeding had a name inside the Mossad's Caesarea unit. Externally, it would come to be known as Operation Spring of Youth. Internally, in the weeks before April 9, 1973, it was a planning problem that kept getting more complicated the closer it got to execution. The 3 targets, Mohammed Yusuf al-Najjar, Kamal Adwan, Kamal Nasser, were not men who lived carelessly. They were senior enough to know they were on lists. They moved with awareness. Their buildings had people around them who noticed things. The kind of precise, floor-by-floor, window-by-window intelligence that the operation required was not something that could be gathered from satellite imagery or intercepted communications alone. It required someone physically present, someone whose presence had an explanation, someone who had been there long enough that their presence no longer required an explanation at all. That was Yael's specific value. Not her training, not her cover story, the duration. The months she had already spent making herself unremarkable in a city that was paying attention to everything. What the planning room in Tel Aviv was working through in early 1973 was not just the tactical question of how to reach the targets. It was a more uncomfortable structural question. How much of this operation was going to rest on a single woman, alone, in Beirut, with no extraction route if something went wrong before the raid began? The answer, when laid out plainly, was almost all of it. The intelligence she was collecting was the foundation the entire military component was being built on. Precise diagrams of the buildings, maps of defensive positions, real-time confirmation of where the targets were sleeping. The naval vessels, the commando units, the coordinated timing, all of it was downstream of what she was producing. If she was compromised before April 9th, there was no operation. If she was compromised on April 9th, there was no operation, and there was also no Yael. Inside the Caesarea command structure, this dependency was understood. Mike Harari, the division's commander, a man who had run some of the most complex field operations in the agency's history, carried it as a personal weight. People who worked with him during this period described him as someone who walked around during Yael's Beirut deployment as if there was something heavy hanging on him that he couldn't set down. That weight had a specific shape. It was the shape of a decision that had already been made: to send one person alone, without a support network, into a city where the consequences of discovery were immediate and irreversible, and the recognition that the decision could not now be unmade without also unmaking the operation. There had been a moment, earlier in the planning process, where the question of abort had been raised, not dramatically, not as a formal proposal. The way these things are raised in intelligence planning, obliquely, framed as a risk assessment, spoken in the language of contingency rather than doubt. The contingency was this: if Yael's cover showed any sign of stress, if her movements attracted any attention, if any element of her reported intelligence seemed inconsistent with what signals intelligence was capturing from the same locations, the operation would pause. Pause. Not abort. Pause. The distinction mattered enormously and was never fully resolved. What Yael was experiencing on the ground in those final weeks before the operation was something her commanders were not positioned to fully see. She was not showing signs of cover stress. Her reports were consistent and precise. By every measurable indicator, she was functioning at a high level, but functioning at a high level under sustained, months-long, completely isolated operational pressure is not the same as functioning without cost. The cost was simply internal, invisible in the reports, present in the person. She was watching men who would be killed because of what she was telling Tel Aviv. She was building the intelligence architecture for their deaths in real time from a distance of yards. She knew their schedules in the way you know the schedule of a neighbor, because you are their neighbor, because you have been their neighbor for months. What that does to a person is not something that appears in an intelligence report. On the night of April 9th, 1973, Yael sat at a table in the Phoenicia Hotel dining room. She was having dinner with a Mossad contact, a man named Eviatar, one of the few people in Beirut she could speak to without a layer of performance between them. They drank wine, they talked. To anyone watching, they were two people having an ordinary evening in a city full of ordinary evenings. He asked about her neighborhood, about her view, about the neighbors across the way. She told him all three were home. That information was relayed. The naval vessels offshore received their signal. The commando teams began moving toward the coast. The operation that had been built piece by piece over months of her work in that city was now in motion and could not be recalled. What she didn't know, sitting in that restaurant, was that the forces were already at sea when she arrived for dinner. The confirmation she provided was the final piece, but the machinery had already begun moving before she gave it, which means the decision to proceed had, in some operational sense, already been made. This is where the assumption from Phase 1 breaks. The assumption was that Yael's real-time intelligence was the condition for the operation, that her confirmation was the gate through which the mission passed or didn't, that the people in Tel Aviv were waiting on her before they committed. They were not fully waiting. They were moving while waiting. The vessels were offshore. The teams were ready. The confirmation she provided completed the picture, but the picture had already been accepted as close enough to complete before she spoke. This is not unusual in intelligence operations under time pressure. The gap between we need final confirmation and we are proceeding on current intelligence is narrow and frequently crossed without announcement. The people in the field are told they are the confirmation. The people in the planning room have already begun treating the current intelligence as sufficient. The gap between those two positions is where operatives live and where they are most alone. The raid succeeded. All 3 targets were killed. The military component executed with a precision that commanders later described as unprecedented. Ehud Barak, who led the ground forces, who had walked through Beirut's streets in a brunette wig as part of the assault team's cover, would later call the intelligence she provided the best he had ever worked from. But when the shooting stopped, Yael was still in Beirut. And here is the hidden cost that was always embedded in the operation's design, that nobody in the planning room had resolved before April 9th, and that now had to be resolved in real time, in a city that was actively investigating what had just happened to 3 of its most prominent residents. She could not leave. Not immediately. A foreign woman disappearing from her apartment on the night of a major Israeli military raid in the city where she lived, that was not invisible. That was a thread. And a thread in the hands of Lebanese or Syrian or Palestinian intelligence services that were now tearing the city apart, looking for answers, led somewhere. So she stayed. The decision to keep her in Beirut after the operation was not made by Yael. It was made for her. The calculation, as best as can be reconstructed from accounts of the period, was straightforward in the way that calculations made by people who are not in the city tend to be straightforward. Her departure would create more risk than her continued presence. The networks she had built, the methods she had used, the intelligence architecture that had made the operation possible, all of it was safer if she stayed, absorbed the aftermath, and left on a timeline that looked ordinary. Her safety was one variable in that calculation. It was not the only variable. Inside the Mossad, in the days after Operation Spring of Youth, there was a specific kind of institutional silence around the question of Yael's continued presence in Beirut. Not silence about the operation itself, that was being processed, assessed, celebrated in the careful internal language of people who know they cannot celebrate too loudly. The silence was specifically around the operational logic of keeping a single female agent in a hostile city while that city was in the middle of a security response to an Israeli military raid. The people who had reason to raise the question of whether that logic was sound were the same people who had already decided it was sound. The abort discussion that might have happened, the formal reassessment of her risk profile in the changed environment of post-raid Beirut, did not happen in any form that anyone later described as meaningful. She was there. The assessment was that she could remain there. She remained. What Marcel Nino might have told her, if Yael had known her story fully, which she may not have, given how carefully the Mossad compartmentalized its own history of female operative losses, is that the phrase the assessment was that she could remain carries a specific weight that is not always visible to the people being assessed. It means we have looked at the variables we know how to measure, and we have concluded that the risk is acceptable. It does not mean we have looked at the variables we cannot measure, the ones that live inside the person in the city, and we have concluded that what we are asking her to carry is survivable. Those are different conclusions. They are frequently presented as the same one. Yael was in Beirut. The city was alert. The people looking for answers were thorough and dangerous. She had no team, no extraction plan that could be activated quickly, no way to signal distress that would result in immediate help. Whether she was going to be all right was a question that Tel Aviv had answered, and she had not. That gap between the answer in the planning room and the reality in the city is where the next several days would be decided, and nobody at that point knew how they would end. The morning after Operation Spring of Youth, Beirut woke up angry. Not the slow-building anger of a city processing bad news. The immediate, street-level anger of a place that understood it had been penetrated, that Israeli soldiers had come ashore in the night, driven through its streets, killed men in their apartments and left before dawn, and that someone had helped them do it. The checkpoints appeared within hours. Lebanese army, Palestinian security, Syrian intelligence assets moving through neighborhoods they did not normally bother with. Every foreign resident of West Beirut became, overnight, a person of potential interest. Yael was a foreign resident of West Beirut. She did not leave her apartment that first morning. That was the correct decision. And she knew it was the correct decision, and knowing that did not make it easier to sit inside four walls while the city outside reorganized itself around the fact of what had happened. The cover she had built over months was solid. That was the truth she returned to. The neighbors knew her. The shopkeepers knew her. She had a routine, a visible life, a social texture that did not appear constructed because she had taken the time to construct it carefully. A woman who panics and leaves the day after a major military raid is suspicious. A woman who goes about her morning as normal is unremarkable. She went about her morning as normal. What she did not know, could not know, because the information was in Tel Aviv and she was in Beirut, was that the security response in the city was operating at a scale that the Mossad's post-operation planning had not fully anticipated. The assumption in the planning room had been that Lebanese authorities would focus their investigation on the points of entry and exit, the coastline, the port, the roads leading south. The commando teams had come from the sea. The logical investigative trail led back to the sea. That assumption was not wrong. It was incomplete. Because Palestinian intelligence, which had lost 3 senior figures overnight, and understood that the scale and precision of the operation required sustained local support, was not following the logical trail. It was pulling a different thread. It was looking at who had been watching, who had been in the neighborhood, who had been there long enough to know things that only someone physically present could know. That was a different investigation, and it was running parallel to the one Tel Aviv had anticipated. On the second day, Yael left the apartment. She followed her routine as closely as she could hold it. The market, a cafe, the kind of ordinary errands that said, "Nothing has changed for me. I am living my life. The events of 2 nights ago are the events of a city I happen to be passing through, not events I am part of." She noticed a man outside her building when she returned. He had not been there before. He was not doing anything that could be described as surveillance, not obviously, not in a way that would hold up as evidence of anything. He was simply present in a way that he had not been present the day before. She went inside. She did not change her behavior. She did not signal Tel Aviv. That decision, to not signal, was not recklessness. It was the application of a principle that had been drilled into every Caesarea operative. A single anomaly is not a pattern. A man outside a building is a man outside a building. You do not break cover for a man outside a building. She was correct by the rules she had been trained on. She was operating in an environment where those rules may no longer have fully applied. The false start came on the 3rd day. There was a moment, a specific, narrow window, when the conditions for her departure aligned. A contact passed her a signal through a method they had established months earlier, a piece of information embedded in something unremarkable that indicated a route was available. Not clean, not comfortable, but available. She prepared to move. Then she stopped. The signal had one element that didn't sit right, a timing detail that was slightly off from the protocol she had been given. Not wrong enough to be obviously wrong. Wrong enough to make her pause in the middle of a decision she had already begun executing. She sat with it for 2 hours, ran it back, ran it forward. The timing detail could have been an error. It could have been a protocol update she hadn't been informed of. It could have been something else entirely, something she did not want to name directly even to herself. She did not move. Later, much later, after she was out and back in Israel and the operation was being assessed, it was determined that the signal had been genuine. The timing detail was an error on the other end, a minor miscommunication in a chain that had been under stress. The route had been real. The window had been real. She had held back from a genuine extraction opportunity because a minor error in the signal looked, in the environment she was operating in, like something that couldn't be trusted. This is what sustained operational pressure does to judgment. It does not destroy it. It calibrates it too tightly. Every variable gets weighted. Every anomaly becomes evidence of something. The same instincts that keep an operative alive in a hostile environment are the instincts that, under enough sustained strain, make a safe exit look dangerous. She stayed in Beirut for another 2 days because of a timing error in a signal. The near abort happened on the 4th day, and it came from Tel Aviv, not from the field. There was a conversation, reconstructed from accounts given years later by people who were adjacent to it rather than in it, in which someone inside the Caesarea command structure raised the question of whether the current conditions in Beirut justified an emergency extraction. The Palestinian investigation was more focused than expected. The city's security environment had not stabilized in the anticipated time frame. The original assumption that post-raid attention would concentrate on coastal entry points was proving in real time to be optimistic. The question was raised. It was discussed. It was not acted on. The reasoning, as best as can be understood from the outside, was twofold. First, an emergency extraction carries its own signature. A foreign woman disappearing through an unconventional route, on an accelerated timeline, in the middle of a citywide security response, creates exactly the kind of anomaly that investigators look for. The cure could be worse than the condition. Second, the assessment was that she was managing. Her signals, the ones she was sending, were controlled and professional. She was not indicating distress. The inference drawn from that in the planning room was that the situation was manageable. The inference was not wrong. It was based on incomplete information. The information she was not sending was the information about what manageable was costing her, day by day, in a city that was quietly tightening around every foreign resident's presence. The false release moment came on the 5th day. The man who had been outside her building was gone. The checkpoints in her immediate neighborhood had reduced. The intensity of the street-level security response, which had peaked in the first 48 hours after the raid, appeared to be easing. She allowed herself, carefully, to read this as improvement. It was not improvement. It was redistribution. The investigation had not contracted. It had shifted, moved upstream, moved into a phase that was less visible at street level precisely because it had become more targeted. The broad, noisy security response of the first days had narrowed into something quieter and more specific. Quieter and more specific was more dangerous. Not less. But from inside an apartment in West Beirut, with no access to the full picture of what Lebanese and Palestinian security services were doing, the absence of visible pressure read as reduced pressure. And reduced pressure after 5 days of sustained containment felt like the beginning of the end of the worst part. She began, cautiously, to think about how the next few days might look, how the departure might be structured. What a normal exit, not emergency, not accelerated, but calibrated and ordinary, might look like from the outside. She was thinking about the end of something that had not yet reached its most dangerous point. What she had survived to this point, the months of construction, the night of the raid, the days of containment had been survivable partly because it was the kind of danger she had trained for. Active, present, requiring constant management. Her skills were precisely calibrated for that kind of danger. What was coming, if it came, would not announce itself. It would arrive through a detail she had already seen and categorized as normal. A neighbor, a shopkeeper, a man with a question that sounded like small talk. The false release was not a strategic error, it was a human one. After 5 days of managing an environment that was trying to find her, the first sign that the environment had eased its grip felt like permission to exhale. She exhaled. She was still in Beirut, and the investigation that had shifted into its quieter, more targeted phase was still running. Whether she was inside it or outside it was a question she did not yet have the information to answer. And the people who might have had that information were in Tel Aviv, working from signals she had sent, drawing inferences about a city they were not inside, The gap between what she knew and what they knew had never been wider, and neither side was fully aware of how wide it had become. She left Beirut on the 6th day, not through the route that had been signaled on the 3rd day, not through any of the contingency paths that had been discussed in the planning stages. She left the way a person leaves when the window is finally, unambiguously open, quietly, on a schedule that looked ordinary, carrying nothing that couldn't be explained. She arrived in Israel. She was received as a hero. That word, hero, is worth examining, because what it did, in the immediate aftermath of Operation Spring of Youth, was foreclose a different conversation. The operation had worked. The targets were dead. The intelligence had been exceptional. The military commanders were effusive. Ehud Barak, who had walked through Beirut's streets in disguise on the night of the raid, would later describe the intelligence she had provided as the most precise he had ever worked from. All of that was true, and all of that made it very difficult to also say, and the 6 days she spent in Beirut afterward were a failure of operational planning that nobody has fully accounted for. Because that is what they were, the assumption that she could remain in the city after the raid, that her departure on an accelerated timeline would create more risk than her continued presence, was made before the raid, based on an assessment of what the post-raid environment would look like. That assessment was wrong in a specific and documentable way. It anticipated a Lebanese and Palestinian security response that would concentrate on points of coastal entry. It did not sufficiently account for the parallel track, the intelligence-driven investigation looking at who had been watching, who had been present long enough to know what she knew. She spent 6 days inside an investigation that her commanders, in Tel Aviv, had not fully anticipated would exist. She managed it. She survived it. The fact that she survived it was then used, internally, as evidence that the planning had been sound. This is the specific logic that makes operational failures self-concealing. When the operative comes home, the question of what they were asked to absorb tends to close. The outcome becomes the assessment of the decision. She could not speak publicly about any of it. Her name was classified. Her role was classified. The operational details of how the intelligence for Spring of Youth had been gathered were classified. She returned to her life in Israel and carried everything she had done in Beirut in the same silence she had carried it there. She married. She retired from the Mossad in the late 1980s after 15 years of service. She lived for decades in a country that knew, in the most senior reaches of its military and intelligence establishment, what she had done, and knew it in a way that could not be expressed publicly without compromising methods that were still in active use. This is a different kind of cost from imprisonment. It is quieter. It does not have a sentence length attached to it, but it is a cost, the inability to be known for what you did in the country you did it for the entirety of your working life and most of the years after. That is not a neutral condition. It is one of the things that gets decided in the planning room, along with the cover story and the extraction timeline, without the operative being present for the decision. The consequences of how the Mossad deployed and then managed female operatives during this period did not arrive as a single reckoning. They arrived incrementally, in cases that each appeared to be discrete failures rather than expressions of a systemic pattern. Lillehammer was the most visible. The 1973 killing of Ahmed Bouchiki, a Moroccan waiter who was not Ali Hassan Salama, who was not connected to Munich, who was on a street in Norway with his pregnant wife, was the point at which the operational infrastructure supporting Wrath of God collapsed publicly. Several operatives were arrested. 2 of them were women, Sylvia Raphael and Marianne Gladnikoff. The trial in Norway was not simply an embarrassment. It was a structural rupture in the Mossad's ability to operate in Western Europe. The countries that had previously extended a kind of implicit tolerance to Israeli intelligence activity on their soil, a tolerance grounded in post-Holocaust political sympathy and shared security interests, reassessed that tolerance in the aftermath of a murder trial in a Scandinavian court. The wrong identification in Lillehammer was made by a team under pressure, working a target that had already survived multiple attempts. operating on a compressed timeline in an environment where the cost of waiting felt higher than the cost of moving. Every one of those conditions had been shaped by decisions made above the level of the people in the field. The team that pulled the trigger on a man who was not their target was the end of a chain. The chain had links in Tel Aviv that were not examined with the same rigor as the links on the ground in Norway. The Vanunu operation produced a different kind of strategic failure, one that was slower to become visible and has never been fully acknowledged in those terms. The rendition of Mordecai Vanunu from Rome to Israel in 1986 was operationally successful. Cheryl Bentoff executed her assignment with precision. The target was removed from British soil, tried in secret, imprisoned. By every internal metric, the mission succeeded. The strategic objective, to suppress the information Vanunu had released, to restore Israeli nuclear ambiguity, to make the story of Dimona recede, was never achieved. His imprisonment kept the story alive in exactly the way that a quiet disappearance might not have. Every year he sat in a cell was a dateline. Every restriction placed on his movement after his 2004 release was a new cycle. The nuclear program he had described remained, for decades, one of the most discussed open secrets in international relations. Discussed specifically because of the visible, ongoing weight of what Israel had done to the man who disclosed it. The mission's design contained this failure from the beginning. The assumption that a secret trial and a long sentence would contain a story that had already been published in a British newspaper, that imprisonment was a form of suppression rather than amplification, was the assumption that was wrong. It was wrong before Cheryl Bentoff made contact in Leicester Square. It was wrong when she sat across from Vanunu in Rome. It was wrong when the INS Noga crossed the Mediterranean. The operative delivered what she was asked to deliver. What she was asked to deliver was built on a premise that did not hold. Marcel Nino was released from the women's prison at Kanathar in February 1968. She was 38 years old. She had gone in at 24. She learned Hebrew. She attended Tel Aviv University. She married 3 years after her return. She had children, the children she had been unable to have during the 14 years she spent in a cell for a mission that the handler had likely already betrayed before it began. She received, eventually, institutional recognition. A military rank equivalent to lieutenant colonel. A torch lighting at Israel's 40th Independence Day. A wedding attended by the Prime Minister, which served in the careful, managed way that Israeli intelligence culture operates, as a public signal that more information about the affair could now be released. What she received was not the same as accountability. The men responsible for activating a potentially compromised network, for ignoring internal doubts about its handler, for sending a 24-year-old woman into a cell that may have already been broken, those men were never held definitively responsible. The inquiry found perjury. It found conflicting testimony. It found a document that may have been fraudulent. It did not find, in any formal sense that resulted in consequence, the person who had decided to proceed. Marcel Nino spent 14 years in a prison that she entered because someone decided the operation was worth running. That person's name remains, in the formal historical record, a matter of dispute. Yael Mann died in August 2021. She was 85. A book about her was published. Former prime ministers paid tribute. The tributes described her correctly, as a woman of exceptional courage, composure, and skill. The tributes did not describe the 6 days after the raid. They did not describe the decision, made in Tel Aviv, to keep her in a city that was investigating her operation. They did not describe the false release moment, the miscalibrated signal, the gap between the assessment in the planning room and the reality on the ground. Those things are known in outline. They are not the part of the story that gets told in the tributes. In October 2023, female intelligence analysts monitoring Hamas activity near the Gaza border had been raising signals, anomalies, changes in pattern, indicators of preparation for months before October 7th. Those signals were reviewed, they were assessed. They were deprioritized by senior male officers who had a different read of what Hamas was capable of and willing to attempt. That failure has its own specific character, but it belongs to the same pattern. The pattern in which the assessments made by women in proximity to the actual situation are weighed against the assumptions held by men further from it, and the assumptions too frequently win. This is not a pattern that began in 2023. It runs through every case in this account. It runs through Cairo in 1954, and Oslo in 1973, and Rome in 1986, and Beirut in the weeks after a raid that everyone described as a triumph. The Mossad's female operatives were exceptional. The record shows that clearly and without ambiguity. What the record also shows, read without the heroic framing, without the redemption arc, without the institutional need to turn sacrifice into tribute, is that exceptional performance was repeatedly asked of people who were given less protection, less acknowledgement, and less accountability on their behalf than the missions they carried out deserved. That is the full picture. Both parts of it are true. If the cases in this account interest you, the sources are there, the books, the declassified documents, the accounts given by the operatives themselves, in the rare moments when they were permitted to give them. Read them. The picture that emerges is more complicated than the tributes suggest. It is also more honest. The consequences did not wait for the operation to finish. That is the part that rarely makes it into the official account. The version that gets told, in briefings, in tributes, in the books that come out decades later when the classification window has partially opened, tends to begin the fallout after a clean endpoint. The mission concludes. Then the consequences arrive. Then the assessment happens. That is not how it worked in any of these cases. In Beirut, the fallout began on the morning after the raid, while Yael was still in the city. The investigation that Palestinian and Lebanese intelligence launched was not a response to a completed operation. It was a response to an ongoing one, because the operation, from Yael's position, was not complete. She was still there, still inside it. The exposure risk that the planning room had assessed as manageable was being actively tested in real time, in a city that was now operating at a different level of alertness than it had been 48 hours earlier. The fallout and the execution were running simultaneously. The people who would later write the assessment were writing it about a situation that was still unresolved while they were writing it. The specific cost of that overlap was absorbed, as it almost always was, by the person in the field. Yael's 6 days in Beirut after the raid were not part of any plan that had been formally approved. They were an improvisation executed under the logic of least bad options, by a command structure that had anticipated a post-raid environment that turned out to be more dangerous than expected. The improvisation was managed, it held, she came home. But the holding cost something. It costed in the way that sustained, isolated, high-stakes containment always costs something. In the body, in sleep, in the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from performing normalcy for an audience that is looking, specifically, for failures of performance. That cost was not measured. There was no framework inside the Mossad at that time for measuring it. The operative came home. The debrief focused on what had been learned, what had worked, what could be improved in future operations of this type. The question of what the 6 additional days had extracted from the person who lived them was not part of the debrief structure. It was filed, instead, under Mission Successful. The strategic consequences of how these operations were designed and executed took different amounts of time to become visible, but they shared a common origin, decisions made on assumptions that were not tested against the full cost of being wrong. The Lillehammer killing produced its consequences fastest, because a dead man on a Norwegian street is not a consequence that can be quietly managed. Ahmed Bouchiki was shot in front of witnesses, in a NATO-aligned country with functioning courts and a free press, by operatives who were arrested before they could leave the city. The trial that followed was not conducted in camera. It was conducted in public, in a country with no history of looking the other way for Israeli intelligence activity, before a legal system that had no particular interest in the political context surrounding the Mossad's campaign against Black September. Several operatives were convicted. 2 of them were women. The diplomatic fallout from Lillehammer reshaped the operational environment across Western Europe in ways that were gradual and therefore easy to undercount. No single government formally withdrew its tolerance for Israeli intelligence operations. What happened instead was a quiet recalibration, a shift in how much unofficial latitude was extended, how readily information was shared, how completely the relevant ministries looked away when Mossad activity was suspected on their soil. That recalibration was not announced. It was expressed in the friction that accumulated over subsequent years, in operations that were harder to run, in assets that were more cautious about their exposure, in an environment that had learned, from a trial in Norway, that the Mossad's operational judgment was not infallible. The wrong assumption, that the man on the street in Lillehammer was Ali Hassan Salameh, had a half-life that extended far beyond the trial. Salameh himself was not killed until 1979, 6 years later, through an operation that required months of patient groundwork by a female operative living in Beirut under a charity worker cover. The operation that was supposed to accelerate the campaign against him had instead delayed it, complicated it, and reshaped the environment in which it eventually had to be executed. One wrong identification, 6 years of additional consequence. The Vanunu case produced its strategic failure more slowly, and it has never been named as a failure in any official Israeli accounting. The internal logic of the operation was that rendition and imprisonment would contain the damage from his disclosures. That logic assumed that a story already published in a British newspaper could be suppressed through the imprisonment of the person who had provided it. It assumed that an 18-year sentence, 11 of it in solitary confinement, would make the story of Israel's nuclear program smaller rather than larger. Every one of those assumptions ran in the opposite direction from the actual outcome. Vanunu's imprisonment was itself a story, and it was a story that ran continuously for 18 years. Every legal challenge, every appeal, every visit from foreign journalists and peace activists, every statement smuggled out of his cell, each of those was a news cycle. The nuclear program he had described was kept in active international discussion, not despite his imprisonment but because of it. The visible, ongoing cost extracted from the man who disclosed it became, for critics of Israeli nuclear policy, a permanent exhibit. The strategic objective, to make the disclosure recede, was never achieved. The method chosen to achieve it guaranteed that it wouldn't be. Cheryl Bentov executed her assignment correctly. She identified the target's psychological vulnerabilities, built a credible relationship, held her cover under direct questioning, and delivered him to the extraction team. None of that is in question. What is in question is the premise she was executing. That premise was wrong before she was assigned to it. The failure is not hers. It belongs to the level of planning that decided imprisonment was the right response to a story that was already published, and then designed a technically successful operation in service of a strategically incoherent objective. Marcel Nino died in October 2019. She was 90 years old. In the final years of her life, she had found something that might be called peace with what had happened to her, a release of the resentment she had carried for decades about the years she had lost, the motherhood that had been delayed, the youth that had been spent in a cell in Connaughter. But peace is not the same as justice, and the two are frequently confused in the way that institutions describe what they have given to the people they have used. What the Israeli state gave Marcel Nino was recognition, military rank, public ceremony, the attendance of a prime minister at her wedding. What it did not give her was accountability. The person who had authorized the activation of a network that was already potentially compromised was never definitively identified. The inquiry found perjury. It found conflicting testimony. It found evidence of falsified documents. It did not find, in any formal sense that produced consequence, the decision that had sent her to Cairo. She spent 14 years in a prison. The person who sent her there was never named. Yael Mon received her recognition in the form of a book, published when she was elderly and in poor health. Former prime ministers offered tributes. Her contribution was described accurately as foundational to one of Israel's most significant operations. Her name, for most of her life, remained classified. The decades between the operation and the book were spent in required silence, in a country that knew, at the highest levels of its military and intelligence establishment, what she had done, and knew it in a way that could not be expressed publicly without compromising methods still in active use. She lived inside that silence. She carried it as a private condition for 48 years. That is not what honoring someone looks like. It resembles it. It uses some of the same language. But requiring someone to be invisible for nearly half a century and then describing them as a legend in the final years of their life is not the same as accounting for what the invisibility cost. The institutional cost of all of this accumulated in a place that institutions are structurally poorly designed to see, in the pattern underneath the individual cases. Each case, examined alone, could be explained. Nino was a wartime loss in a compromised operation. Lillehammer was a misidentification under pressure. Vanunu was a successful rendition with unforeseen strategic consequences. Yael Man was a triumph with an imperfect extraction timeline. Each explanation is partial. Each is accurate as far as it goes. What none of them account for is what the cases share: women sent into situations where the planning room's assumptions were tested against their bodies, their years, their freedom, their silence, and where the gap between those assumptions and reality was consistently absorbed by the operative rather than by the institution that produced it. That pattern did not change because of any single reckoning. It changed, slowly and partially, because enough cases accumulated that the pattern became undeniable to the people who needed to see it. Some of those people are still working. Some of what they changed is real. What was lost in the process of that change, the years, the freedom, the silence, the unbornness of futures that 14 years in an Egyptian prison foreclosed, does not appear in the doctrine revision. It is simply gone. These cases are documented. The sources exist in books, in declassified files, in the accounts that operatives gave in the narrow windows when they were permitted to speak. If this account raised questions that you want to follow further, those sources are worth finding. The picture they show is more complete than any single version of it, and more honest than most.